Today on Stock Charts in Focus, we're turning you into the expert veteran market analyst that you've always wanted to be. We're going to show you how to take your analysis to the next level using our seasonality charts. These let you dig deeper into the price action, go beyond the surface of just what you're seeing on those price charts, use history and put it to your advantage out there in the markets. Whether you're looking at stocks, ETFs, indexes, you name it, seasonality charts can help take your analysis to the next level. You're going to see how on today's show. Of course, you know what it is. It's all new. It's all here. It's Stock Charts in Focus. All right, my friends, welcome to the show, Stock Charts in Focus. Of course, our product focus show here on the channel where we dig into the site, dive into those features, walk through those tools, and ultimately help you get more value out of stock charts. That's our mission here every Friday up on the Stock Charts TV channel. My name is Grayson Rose, Director of Operations here at StockCharts.com. As always, fantastic to be back with you. For an episode like this one, I get really excited. I got to tell you why. Seasonality charts, one of those things that the experts know and love. If you poll some of the veteran chartists out there, people that have been using technical analysis and charting their way through the markets for a long time, one of the things that you will hear from pretty much everyone out there is, I like to study market history. I think that market history is incredibly important, and I like to know exactly what's happened in the past so that I can use that as a guide for what's likely to happen in the future. One of the ways that people do that, pretty much the way that people do that, to be honest, is to look at seasonal patterns out there in the markets. Whether you're looking at the index level up top, different sectors of the market, or all the way down into the individual stocks within, seasonality drives the markets. The reality is that there are times of year when stocks do better. There are times of year when stocks are seasonally weaker. You've probably heard things like sell in May and go away. Well, really what that is talking about is the seasonal patterns that exist out there in the markets. Now, sell in May and go away might not actually be the case, as you might see when you dig into these seasonality charts, but the point still stands. Seasonality, looking into past price history, using those averages to see what different indexes or sectors or stocks have done at specific times of the year. That's how you bring market history into your approach. It serves as an amazing backdrop for your analysis, really kind of lets you dig deeper beyond just the price action, just beyond what's happening right now. Lets you go deeper into the surface and really study what's happened in the past. So the seasonality chart tool on Stock Charts, very easy to use, very simple to understand, incredibly simple to incorporate into your process. But on the show today, you're going to see the power of this thing, and it really is going to make you an expert chartist. You're going to be out there with your friends saying, hey, I'm using seasonality, so here's what I'm seeing in the markets. It's going to take your analysis to the next level. So without further ado, let's jump over to the site and get it going. We're starting on our charts and tools page because the first thing that we got to do is show you how to get to these seasonality charts. So this is the directory of kind of everything that exists on Stock Charts. We highlight this page a ton. Links to pretty much all of the tools and resources around the site. Up at the top, though, under more charting tools, you'll see a card right here for seasonality. Again, those charts that show monthly price performance trends over a period of time that you get to select. So you can type in a symbol right in this box, hit go, you'll be off to the races. But I also want to mention that at the very top of any page around the Stock Charts platform, you can open up this menu that typically says Sharp Chart, that's the default, and you can select any of these charting tools from this menu to quickly jump to a chart of any symbol that you are interested in. So for instance, we can select seasonality from this menu. We can type in something like SPY, the S&P 500 ETF, hit go, and we are off to the races. So let's talk about what these charts are, and then we'll start to get into some of the reasons why these charts are so important. So to start, this is going to default to a 5-year view. You can see that down at the bottom. You've got that 5 selected in that menu. Now, when you click and drag on this little menu, you can move between different 5-year blocks, sort of move through time. But the other important thing is that you can actually drag this slider out all the way back to 20 years worth of data. So when you set this to 20, what you're looking at now is for each month of the year over the last 20 years, what was the average move for SPY, or whatever symbol you are charting, and what percentage of the time did it move higher in that month? So you can see along the bottom here, we're looking at 20 years worth of data. We've got one bar for each month of the year. We've got 12 bars, January through December. Two numbers that you need to be aware of on these charts. First up is the number at the very top. That's the one that's a little more obvious. What this number represents is what percentage of the time, SPY in this case, closed higher in that month. So we can see something like the month of January. SPY over the last 20 years has only closed higher in the month of January 50% of the time, 10 out of 20. 50% of the time, January has been a positive month for SPY. 50% of the time, January has been a negative month for SPY. We can see that that is actually the lowest number out of the entire year. January is a very, very tricky month for stocks. We can see other months, for instance, April, very high probability month. We typically move higher in April. The month of April, over the last 20 years, up 84% of the time. So that's what that number across the tops of these bars represents, the percentage of time that that month has closed higher over the period of time that you have selected. Now, the number at the bottom of the bar, right above the month, is the average move in that month. So actually, January, we are 50-50 and we are flat over the last 20 years. The average move for January over the last 20 years is 0. It doesn't move in January. Now, that, of course, means that we have some months that are up big. We've got some months that are down big. We've got some months that are in between. But on average, the typical move over the last 20 years in SPY, the S&P 500, it's a flat month and it's up 50% of the time, only 50% of the time, only half the time. Now, the other numbers across the bottom, again, these are the average move in these months. So we can start to look across these seasonality charts and see what percentage of the time this particular security goes up in a given month and what the average move is. So again, let's return to April. 84% of the time the S&P 500 closes higher in April, and the average move out of the S&P 500 in April over the last 20 years, 2.3%. Now, if you see, of course, a negative sign in front of any of these numbers, that means that the average move is lower. So really, really interesting, especially when we see a month like June that actually on average is a gainer. But those down months those down Junes over the last 20 years mean that we actually see on average a loss in the month of June. So again, the idea behind these seasonality charts, they let you dig deeper into what typically happens across years over any given period of time. They let you dig deeper into the seasonal patterns that we typically see. Now, we've seen, for instance, a lot of conversation, especially this past year, about weakness in August, September, and October, but then strength at the end of the year, strength in Q4. What was so interesting about 2023 is that while it was scary what the markets did in, for instance, September and into October, they actually followed this seasonal playbook really, really closely. We can see that, for instance, the average August is really almost a flat month. Not much happens in August typically for the S&P 500. And September, on average, is a down month. Now, we see October starts to get a little bit better, and we rally typically in November and into December as well. November and December, typically very, very strong months over the last 20 years for the S&P 500. So this is where I want to mention, the thing that we always get, the question that we always get, especially whenever I show people these seasonality charts, is what does this do for me? Why is this important? How am I supposed to use this? Well, I love to describe seasonality charts as a backdrop to whatever is happening in the markets. So it's not that I'm going to go out and buy the S&P 500 because April is typically a strong month. If we see that the S&P 500 is weak heading into April and continues to be weak in April, well, then that's the reality. That is what is happening. But these seasonality charts, this seasonal data, these seasonal patterns become a great backdrop to think about the markets. So for instance, back in 2023, in August, September, and October, when we saw that weakness, to me and to other expert chartists who were following these seasonal patterns and know the seasonality of particular indexes like the S&P 500, that weakness that we saw in the fall of 2023 wasn't necessarily that scary because, again, it was following the seasonal pattern, following the seasonal playbook. That weakness was something that we actually could sort of anticipate and expect as chartists because it was doing something that it sort of normally does. Now, when the opposite is true, when you see the markets really, really weak in, for instance, November or April, times that are typically very strong, again, that's an interesting backdrop for what's happening in the markets. We're sort of bucking the seasonal trend, right? That's a different perspective on what's happening in the markets. So again, these seasonal charts, seasonality charts, are I like to call them a backdrop. Some other people kind of call them, an additional piece of context, a little more context to what's happening in the markets. But they do provide a lot of kind of deeper level, historically backed perspective for whatever you're seeing out there in the markets or sectors or specific stocks. So again, we can use these for any number of securities. Let's look at something like XLK, a big fan favorite, of course. We can see some very, very interesting seasonal patterns. Again, let's do the last 20 years here. Some really, really interesting seasonal patterns here in XLK. June, typically not a big gainer, but July, a huge month for XLK, huge month for technology. So you can start to really kind of address and study these different seasonal patterns for different securities. We can do this for stocks. Let's say we wanted to look up Apple, the seasonality on Apple here. We can drag this again out to 20 years. We could narrow this down into, let's say, 10 years. Again, we can dig into the seasonal history, the seasonal patterns for stocks, for ETFs, for sector funds, for indexes, you name it. You can seasonality chart it, if you will. So very, very cool charts. The other couple things that we can do with these charts, let's actually go back to the S&P 500. We'll return back to SPY, and we'll drag this back out to our 20-year chart. Couple other little features of these charts that make them incredibly powerful. Actually, Dave Keller just did an article recently highlighting some of these features, highlighting how they matter, why they're important. So I'll point you to that at the end of the show. We'll make sure that you have a link to Dave's article. But he did a great job of highlighting some of the other ways to use these seasonality charts. What Dave was doing in that article is actually using these little menus up at the very top. So I want to point you to this right now, and then we'll dig into some of the features down at the bottom as well. When you load up a certain number of years, let's say 20 years, you've got all of those listed right up here at the top. These actually are clickable buttons though. So if you wanted to turn off any years or turn on any years, you can simply click the ones that you want to turn on or off. When they're highlighted in white, that means that they are a factor in the seasonality chart you're looking at. But when they are turned off, that means that they are going to be disabled in gray, and they will not be a factor of that seasonality chart. So one of the really interesting things that Dave did in this article that I will point you to at the end of the show was he actually went in here and turned off all of the years that were not election years. So he's going to go through here and leave in white only the years that were election years. This actually allows you to take the last 4 election cycles, 4 election years, and look at the seasonality of just those years. So here you can really start to dig into these charts and see seasonality for years that might be similar to the year that we have on our hands right now. So in this case, in Dave's article, as you'll see, he was able to actually pull up 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020 and look at the seasonal patterns of those election years. Now, really, really interesting things happen here. For instance, first part of the year, typically pretty weak. We do not see a lot of up months in Q1 of the last couple election years, and we do actually see an average loss in all 3 of these months. January, February, and March, the last 4 election years, have actually been down months. We buck that trend, though, in the spring and into the summer. So April, May, June, and July get a little bit stronger. We are typically 3/4 of the time we are up on those years, and we can see some pretty heavy gains. April, again, remember we were talking about April earlier. April, a 4.3% average gain. May, a 0.5% average gain. June actually kind of offsets that 0.5 average loss, and 2.5% average gain in July over the last 4 election years. August, every single election year of the last 4 has been up, average gain 2.8%. But then as we actually get into that election, things start to get pretty choppy. So September, average down month. October, we have not seen a positive October in the last 4 election years. And the average move on the S&P 500, down 5.6%. So really, really tough October. But of course, once we get through that election in early November, things really start to turn around. We actually see investors pile back into the markets. And over the last couple of election years, we've seen Big moves out of November and December, especially in December. All 4 years have closed higher in the last 4 election years. So this is a great example of how these seasonality charts can really add more context to what's happened in the past and what might be happening this year or in other election years. So for instance, the way I would be sort of looking at this, the way that Dave is looking at it, as you'll see in that article that I mentioned, as we see 2024, another election year here, as we go through this year, you can sort of think about the performance of something like the S&P 500 relative to what the past couple of election years have done. This can provide a lot of context and sort of a potential roadmap for where the indexes are maybe likely to head throughout this year. A great example of how expert technicians, veterans that have been out there doing this for a long time, really let kind of history guide them. Again, it's not about taking a specific action. You're not buying the S&P 500 just because the seasonality is such, or buying Nike or something like that just because it's seasonally strong in 1 month. You're still letting the real price action of today's market drive your actions out there. But the seasonality, again, provides a little bit more context, kind of provides a backdrop, as I like to say, to those moves. So some really, really interesting options that you have up at the top of these seasonality charts. Now I'm going to hit refresh on this page just to kind of reset us. We'll get back to those 5 years. Let's drag this back out though, and I want to touch on a couple of the other options that you have with these seasonality charts. Down in the bottom left corner, we've got some interesting little menus. We've got the sort of histogram option selected right now. So by default, you're going to see these seasonality charts with those histogram bars. Again, 1 bar per month. If you want to actually see the move for any of these specific years, though, for any security that you are looking at a seasonality chart of, you've got a couple of different options. You've got a same scale mode. And next to that, you've got a separate mode. Let's start with same scale. So when you put these into the same scale mode, what that's going to do, it's going to take all of the years that you are charting, all of the years that you're looking at that seasonal data for, and it's going to put those on a percentage scale. So you can actually compare each of those different years. If you want to see, for instance, over the last 5 years, let's do something a little more narrow so this is a little easier to see. You can see here SPY over the last 5 years. We'll actually drag this back so we have full history for 2023. We've now got 5 lines on these charts that show us the exact move, not just the percentage move, but also how it's moved throughout that year for the last 5 years. Here we can compare 2019, 2020, 21, 22, and 23 on the S&P 500. We can see exactly how those years have played out. We can see which years were big gainers. We can see which years were laggards. In this case, obviously 2022, a tough year. And when we hover over any of these lines, we actually kind of get that highlighted. So especially when you have a larger number of years, let's say you've got 15 years on that chart, makes it nice and easy to see when you hover over any of those lines. You can kind of see those a little better. Again, you've still got those different options. So if you want to turn on or turn off any specific years, maybe you want to turn off all of these years and just focus on, for instance, 2009. There you go. You can see exactly how 2009 played out. And then when you're ready, either refresh the page or go in and click those again, and you can quickly reset that seasonality chart. So same scale mode, a really, really nice way to compare different years. The other option that you have is the separate mode. So if you want to kind of study each year just the way that it's moved on its own, the separate mode will actually separate those kind of into their own part of the chart. So you can see, which years have kind of followed each other, which years haven't. Let's say we drag this back out again to be 20 years. We can go in here and leave, for instance, those election years on this chart. And we can actually study kind of how those have played out relative to each other. So we can leave 2024 on, actually. That's kind of an interesting thing to do. But here we've got our election years, and again, all broken out onto kind of their own part of the chart. So we can see how these play out, whether they're following each other or sort of following a different roadmap. Other than this year here, we can see that these actually kind of do, for the most part, follow each other. That was 2008, by the way. But we do see a lot of kind of similar patterns to these years. And again, we can turn those years on, turn those years off. We could put these also onto the same scale mode here. See, obviously 2008 was a bit of a rocky year there with the whole financial collapse. But what's interesting to see is that the other 3 election years that we're looking at have kind of followed a pretty similar trajectory and actually end up with pretty similar performance. So out of 2012, 2016, and 2020, we've actually seen some pretty similar results those couple of election years there. So interesting things that you can do here with these seasonality charts. Again, you've got a couple of different ways to review these. Now, the final thing that I'm going to mention is the compare to option. I love using this because it brings relative strength into the seasonality approach. So for instance, if we wanted to see, we'll go back to Apple. We can obviously look at our seasonality of just Apple on its own, but we can also think about seasonality of Apple or any security versus something else like the S&P 500. So if we want to look over the last 20 years, what are the months where Apple has outperformed SPY, the S&P 500? What are the years where Apple has lagged the S&P 500? That's what we can do with this compare to option on these seasonality charts. So we can really not only take our price analysis, but also our relative strength analysis to the next level. We can look at seasonal patterns over a period of time for any security versus another one. I like to use this benchmarked against either SPY or, in my case, VTI is typically what I like to use. VTI is very similar to SPY, but it's the Vanguard Total Index, represents the total US stock market. So in this case, we're asking, hey, when has Apple outperformed the market and when has Apple underperformed the market? We can see that typically in years like October, Apple has very strong seasonality against the total market, typically outperforms the market by 3.8%. And 79% of the time over the last 20 years, Apple has been an outperformer in that month. We can see other weaker months like June. Typically, Apple does not outperform the market in June, actually underperforms by a bit and only outperforms 47% of the time. So again, great ways to kind of take your analysis to the next level, whether you're looking at price on its own, digging into kind of price history, or if relative strength is part of your approach and you want to think about when particular securities are going to outperform or underperform, this is another great way to do it. Now, of course, we can do this with individual stocks. One of the best ways to use this, though, is thinking back to those sectors. So let's take XLK versus SPY. This is going to tell us when has technology outperformed versus SPY. Over the last 20 years, when has technology been an outperformer of the S&P 500? When has technology lagged the S&P 500? We can start to answer those questions. And again, really, really interesting things to dig into across sectors. So we could actually look at all of the different 11 sectors versus the market. Think about when they are seasonally strong, when they are seasonally weak, but also on a relative basis, when are those strong, when are those weak against something like the S&P 500. So very interesting things that we can do here with these seasonality charts. But again, my suggestion to you is to bring this into your analysis because it really is a great way to incorporate history right into your approach. It's not just about knowing that history of the market, but kind of keeping it in the textbooks and not really bringing it into your approach. These seasonality charts really let you use that seasonal history, use that price history, bring it into your approach, bring a little bit more context to kind of what you're seeing out there in the markets, and drive some better decisions as a result. So finally, before I let you go, I do want to point you to David's article because it was a great, great example of how these seasonality charts can be used. Back here on our articles page, you, of course, can see all of our different articles that we publish. But in the Mindful Investor blog, where David Keller writes, Dave is our chief market strategist. Dave had a great, great analysis using some of these seasonality charts. So here's what you can see from Dave's article. He was actually going back even one more cycle. He dragged that seasonality chart back 1 year, which kind of unlocks 2004. So in his case, actually, Dave is looking at 2004, 08, 2012, 2016, and 2020. So he's actually got one more election year than we were looking at previously. But as you can see, Dave using these seasonality charts in his approach, using it as a little bit more context to kind of what he's seeing out there in the markets. Great article. I highly suggest that you use or check out this article. Give this a read. If you're interested in seasonality charts, if you're interested in what's going to happen in the markets this year, Dave's article is a great one to take a look at. So that is our show for today, digging into those seasonality charts, again, helping you level up your analysis, digging beyond, a little deeper, beyond those standard price charts, getting into history, price history out there in the markets, whether you're looking at the indexes, sectors, other asset classes, or individual stocks. Seasonality charts should have a place in your process. They are a fantastic way to bring more perspective to your analysis, bring more perspective to your market analysis, your individual security analysis, whatever you're doing. Seasonality charts are important. If it's got price history, you might as well think about the seasonality of it. Even things like, obviously, a lot of talk right now about Bitcoin. Think about the seasonality of Bitcoin. When do we see buyers step in? When do we see buyers leave? And we see a little bit more of a weaker period for that cryptocurrency, that key cryptocurrency. So no matter what you are charting, no matter what you're thinking about, seasonality charts have a place in your process. And again, this is one of those things that the experts in the room always love to talk about. They are thinking about these seasonal patterns. They know them, maybe even sometimes by heart, and they're thinking about the moves out there in the markets relative to the sort of seasonal patterns that we typically see over time or in specific years. So a great tool, one that you should definitely study, hopefully have some fun with. We do also have a chart list view called seasonality. So actually, one of the other things that we didn't highlight on the show, you can create a chart list in your account, pull up the seasonality view, and flip through that list. Again, whether you're looking at indexes, maybe you have a list full of the sectors of the market, or even your own portfolio. This is a great thing to study for the positions that you have. If you own stocks and ETFs, for instance, think about the seasonality of those positions, especially if you're a longer term investor, even if you're trading over the short term, but especially if you're a longer term investor. Knowing, understanding, seeing those seasonal patterns out there for the things that you own, incredibly important. So use that chart list view, use the standalone version as well. Seasonality charts, I think it's one that you're going to really fall in love with over time. So I want to thank you again for joining me on the show today. Always great to be with you. Again, we do this every Friday, digging into the site, talking about tools, features, always in the context of what's happening out there in the markets, of course. But our mission here on this show to get you more value out of StockCharts. So many tools and features to know, tips, tricks, tutorials, all that good stuff is always here. But there's so much value that we can unlock in the StockCharts platform. This is where we do it together every Friday, digging into different corners of the website, making sure that you're aware of all the things you can do on StockCharts. Now, one big announcement that I do want to leave you with, we've got some huge things coming out in the next couple of weeks. Some big product launches, new features, new tools, enhancements, updates, lots of incredible stuff. We are going to be digging into that over the next couple of weeks as those different tools and features roll out throughout StockCharts. We've got things for sharp charts, scans, ACP, new summary pages, lots and lots of incredible things to share with you. This is going to be the place to do it. Of course, we'll keep you posted in our Chart Watchers newsletter. Make sure you're following that. But this is where we are going to let you know of everything that's been released on the site. We'll dig into it together. We'll walk through some of those different things. Make sure that you're fully aware of everything that has launched on StockCharts. We'll have our release notes as well. So we've done that. If you followed our last couple product launches, we will have a page that highlights everything that's been launched on the site. So keep an eye out for that. But again, next couple of weeks, we're going to have some big announcements here on StockCharts. Big things that are going to take your charting to the next level. So keep an eye out for that. But I will be back with you next Friday for another episode of the show. Again, my name is Grayson Rose, Director of Operations here at StockCharts.com. It's been wonderful to be with you. I'll see you again next time for another episode of StockCharts in Focus. But until then, chart on, my friends.